When Syphon Filter 3 hit in late 2001, many reviewers dubbed it as the last big hurrah of the PS1's library, the final big-budget blockbuster title to be released for the system, as developers' main focus had already shifted to the next generation of gaming. They saw it as the final swan song of Sony's first console, and I would say that's probably still an accurate assessment of Syphon Filter 3. It's not that more high-quality games weren't released or at least localized here in North America in the years following Syphon Filter 3, or even that Sony themselves would abandon the PS1 altogether, still releasing the yearly crop of sports games like Game Day. However, when it comes to mainstream popular franchises, all others had already moved on, leaving Syphon Filter 3 to be that final big-budget blockbuster title on the PS1. Syphon Filter 3 was the last mainstream, if you will, quote-unquote, AAA title to release on the PS1. A franchise that came out of nowhere with the original, reached its peak of popularity by the second game, and finished strong with the third, and outside of the PSP releases, would never quite reach the same mainstream notoriety it once had. Make no mistake though, for its generation, Syphon Filter was one of the most popular franchises around, even mentioned alongside other big-name games like Metal Gear Solid. Now, there were other games that trickled out in North America after Syphon Filter 3, games like C-12 Final Resistance, The Italian Job, and Delta Force, but none of them were as high profile or as mainstream recognizable as Syphon Filter. Therefore, I think dubbing it the last hurrah of the PS1's library still holds up to this day, especially when you realize its late November release meant that it was reviewed in the same cycle as the release of Metal Gear Solid 2, Grand Theft Auto 3, and the launch crop of games from both the GameCube and Xbox, and depending on which publication reviewed it, still reviewed well. For example, Game Informer gave this game a 9 out of 10, in the same issue they gave Metal Gear Solid 2 a 10, and GTA 3 and Rogue Leader a 9.5. EGM and GameSpot gave it a 6.5 out of 10, but I almost never agreed with either of those sources' reviews, and looking back, I still don't. Now, it's been about 20 years since I last played through Syphon Filter 3, give or take, and I'm really glad I took the time to revisit it again. I always remember really liking this game, even in the years since I first played through it. It had left a good enough impression on me that I held it in high regard, even if it had been such a long time since I first played it that some of the missions in the game were actually new to me, even if I did play all the way through it previously. Some were familiar, but some surprised me again. Somewhere between playing the game for the first time and treading familiar ground. When it comes to Syphon Filter games, I'm not sure where I stand on which is the best. Objectively, I would say Syphon Filter 2 is probably the best, but even though I own 2 copies of the game, I haven't played far into it since I rented it back in the year 2000. Perhaps I'm just a weenie, but the biggest takeaway of the second game I remember was it was spectacular, but absurdly difficult as well. An amazing game, but I haven't mustered up that want to play through it again. I do remember tons of force stealth missions, tons of flak-jacketed enemies, and tons of head-shooting flak-jacketed snipers. Kind of a pain in the butt from what I remember. I'll replay it again someday, I'll get over it and stop being a weenie. I would say that the original is still my favorite, because it's the one I've played the most, but Syphon Filter 3 is still such a good game. I kept saying, man, I really like this game as I played through it. Sure, it was more of the same when it came to the first two, but that still means it's a PS1 era masterpiece, and the game just flows so well. Syphon Filter 3 explores the origins of the Syphon Filter virus and fills in gaps from the 2 previous games, while also bringing the story to its final conclusion, at least for that generation of gaming. The story setup is a congressional inquiry into the actions of Gabe Logan and his cohorts, who are being set up to take the fall for the actions of the agency, the super secret government agency Logan worked for in the 2 previous games that apparently never existed. Each testimony shown through CGI FMV cutscenes is the setup for each of the 19 varied missions in the game, filling in the gaps of what happened before the first game and since the previous game, and how Gabe came to meet each of his comrades. Along the way, players get to play as 3 other characters besides Logan himself. The story is easy to follow and the whole game just flows well. Syphon Filter 3 is probably the easiest game in the series, at least for me. This might be why it flows a lot easier than the previous games, but the developers made, in my mind, some smart design decisions like cutting down on the frustrating required stealth missions. Those missions where being spotted is an instant mission over, causing constant, frustrating restarts and failures. There are still a couple of stealth scenes, but the game is a lot more straightforward in its design this time around, and I think it's a lot better for it. Again, the 2 previous games were amazing games, but I can say I am still a fan of having less of these scenes in Syphon Filter 3. And saying this is the easiest Syphon Filter game still doesn't mean this game is a breeze either. I would say it's a little more balanced, but there will still be plenty of deaths and checkpoint restarts, and thankfully, the devs brought back the ability to save and quit at each mission checkpoint, first introduced in Syphon Filter 2. If you've played any of the Syphon Filter games before this, you know what to expect. A game mirroring the pacing of a Hollywood action thriller movie of the Tom Clancy variety. Superb gunplay that is as fun as it is stylistic, varied mission locales with a good assortment of design styles behind them, and very strict objective-based gameplay that makes beating a tough scene incredibly satisfying, all combined to make a game and a series that easily rivaled and maybe even surpassed the venerable Metal Gear Solid as the PlayStation's best action games. What makes Syphon Filter so great isn't just the thriller pacing, the well-designed and well-thought-out missions and objectives. All that is a great combination and foundation to build on. However, the best part for me has always been the gunplay, and Syphon Filter 3 closes the series' PS1 efforts off in fantastic fashion in that regard. Dare I be so brave to say that in the days of pre-dual analog aiming and movement, the developers created a gunplay system that is vastly superior to any that came before or any of its entire generation. Nowadays, we are all spoiled by modern left-stick move, right-stick aim schemes, but the 3 ways of aiming in the Syphon Filter franchise just feel so intuitive. I think this series actually plays better without dual analog aiming. The Omega Strain tried, bless its little heart, and Dark Mirror is a solid title I own as well, but the gunplay in the first 3 games leaves the more modern efforts in the dust. Add in touches like that awesome blowback when you shotgun a foe, the thrill of running in one direction while shooting in another, and yes, even the mighty taser, and you have a series that just feels so much better to play in its PS1 efforts than its next-gen sequels.
How about the taser?
Yeah, taser wouldn't be bad. It might leave a little rash mark.
While playing through this game again, I kept saying, man, I'm glad I played this again. It's not that there weren't some frustrating parts in the game, but as a whole, from the flow to the gunplay to even the story, Syphon Filter 3 hit better 20 years later than when I first played it. I was in my zone, just enjoying every moment I spent with the game this time through, and being amazed at how well Sony Bend Studios finished their PS1 race. On top of the good pacing of the game, the frame rate is buttery smooth. No matter how much action is going on screen, it's all smooth. Running, shooting, and quickly zooming into first-person view to pop a headshot are all butter. They're butter. It's like butter, I'm telling you. The controls, which were tightened up in the second game, are just as tight in the third, and the sound effects are pleasing to the ear, and there are even clever sound clues like higher tempo music that plays to tell you there is an enemy nearby. I also really love the Syphon Filter title screen music. I think it's iconic, at least, to PS1 gamers. On top of the single player, there are also various challenge modes to play and even a 2-player deathmatch option. One-on-one deathmatch has never appealed to me, but the challenge modes are solid and get harder as you go along. Nothing Time Splitters-esque here, but a good addition to an already polished package. There would be other games that would be localized and released in the years following, but if Syphon Filter 3 is the last hurrah of the PS1's lifespan, then it's safe to say that the PS1 ended on a strong note, with a game that's quality has stood the test of time, at least in my opinion. Regardless of whenever it was released, it was still one of the best games released in one of the most incredibly competitive eras of gaming, going up against the launch of 2 systems and the release of Metal Gear Solid 2. The game was released late enough to have an advertisement for SOCOM US Navy SEALs on the back of the game's manual. Not many systems get to ride out into the sunset with their last big high-profile title being as good as Syphon Filter 3 was, and as an avid PS1 fan, I'm happy to see the system left us on such a high note. The bottom line here, Syphon Filter 3 is the final polish to one of the best action series of the 5th generation, if not the best, arguably. While you might be more inclined to like either of the first 2 better, this is the culmination of Sony Bend Studios' PS1 efforts, and possibly the best way to send off my favorite console of all time. If you haven't played through this game in decades either, hunt it down and give it another playthrough sometime. Like me, you might come to appreciate it more now than when you first played it.